Okay, we are live.
Yeah, it is not started yet. देखिए एक बार. Let me check the YouTube. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, it is. It's not showing anyone, but I think. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
I think it has started. Welcome everyone to today's session of Posthumanism and India, Envisioning and Manifesting. This is the
Samrat can't hear you.
Yeah, Samrat has left, I suppose. I mean, he's got a poor connection.
Yes, maybe.
Yeah, then he'll be joining in a moment, I think. Auditor, is it on?
Ma'am, the live is on, but there's some problems. I think the video is not getting shown there. I'm checking into it.
Okay, fine.
No, Samrat is missing. I think Samrat is disconnected.
Samrat is not there anymore. You're okay. So Devashishta, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. So, will you just pick it up then?
Should we start? Do you think I should start it off or wait a little bit?
Now we have to wait for a while because the YouTube is not all. It's also not working.
Right.
So let's wait for a while.
Yes.
And
yes.
So I'm trying to connect to Samrat. Let me see what kind of problem is having.
Yeah, I'm back. There was some technical problem, I think. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Yes.
শোনা যাচ্ছে? Am I audible?
Yes, Samrat, yes.
Okay. So I hope there will be no disconnections now. Yeah, there is some problem with the connection. I'll just switch off. দেখা যাচ্ছে না? আচ্ছা।
এখন দেখা যাচ্ছে, ঠিক আছে, all okay.
I think I should switch off my computer and then the connectivity will be better. Yeah, দেখা যাচ্ছে তো? I hope.
Yeah, Samrat, you can start off.
Okay. I just wanted to say that there are some technical issues with Google Meet, and we have tried to solve that problem, and we have shifted to the Zoom platform. And as I will be doing in the first session, we have Dr. Arka Chattopadhyay as our keynote speaker, and followed by that there will be a panel on nation state and neoliberalism. This is the morning session, and I hope the Google Meet problem gets solved by the end of this day, and in the evening we can use the same link which has been sent to you. Otherwise we will inform. Please bear up with us because it's a global problem and we are trying to solve it. I hope by the end of the day things will be better. So, and that is the situation as of now. Just give me a minute. I will read the name of the participants today because there is some problem. I just switched off my. Okay, let me introduce the today's speaker, Dr. Arka Chattopadhyay, who is an assistant professor of IIT Gandhinagar, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. He has done his PhD from Western Sydney University on Beckett and Lacanian psychoanalysis. I am sure that some of you are aware of his work. He has edited and published some books like Deluge and Beckett, Knots, Post-Lacanian Psychoanalysis, and he's also the founding editor of the International Journal of Literature and Cultural Studies, Shanglap. And he has also co-edited a book on Navarun Bhattacharya from Bloomsbury, and now related to posthumanism, he's working on a monograph on posthumanism, which is going to be published from Orient Black Swan. With this brief introduction, I would also say that Arka is a long friend, and we have worked together, and his scholarship is of great height, and you will see, I listen to him. I always like to listen to his talk. With this brief note, I open up the lecture to open up the mic to virtual mic to Arka Chattopadhyay and stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Samrat. So I hope I'm audible and visible with not too many.
Yeah,
okay.
You are both audible and visible. Thank you.
So a very good morning to everyone, especially if you're in India. I suppose it's perhaps a little too early for some of you, but hopefully we'll make sense of it as we go along. So first and foremost, a thank you to all the organizers of this wonderful conference and this great academic network that has been set up on posthumanism in India. It tiptoed quite beautifully with my current interest in posthumanism, and of course, thank you for that very warm introduction, Samrat. I must say I did not edit the books that you mentioned there. I contributed to those edited volumes, but I've edited a few other volumes. Nevertheless, it's just a quick clarification. Okay, so let's come to today's topic, and I hope this goes reasonably well with the set of papers we have in the session that will follow the talk. I've called this talk, Can the State be Posthuman? As a kind of an open question. When I was thinking about this talk and preparing for it, one of the things that I noticed, especially when we think of the scholarship in posthumanism, the discussions around politics and ethics of posthumanism, is the under-theorization of the state. That's a very interesting phenomenon that I spotted. There's a certain under-theorization of state, the nation state, or state as a function in the posthumanist political literature, the literature that addresses political and ethical questions in posthumanism. What we have in those discussions is more of a discussion of the subject, the political subject or the social subject, the ethical subject. And as we know, there has been a lot of, first of all, of course, I mean, it goes without saying, posthumanism is not one consorted theory. It's a series of very different discourses. And there's a lot of internal dialectic, even internal conflict, if we may say so. For example, the entire discussion around a critique of transhumanism within posthumanism has its own politics. I mean, a certain philosophical posthumanism or a certain discourse of philosophical posthumanism, what is sometimes called emancipatory posthumanism, is grounded on a critique of transhumanism. And in this particular critique, transhumanism is the capitalist avatar of a technologically mediated subject, to the point that it actually erases the subject. So the political ethical task of posthumanism in this particular orientation, let's say, has been to challenge this subjectless ontology. To speak like Rossi Braidotti, the task of posthumanism is not to get rid of the subject, but to resituate the subject. So the discussion around politics and ethics in posthumanism has been, in a way, concentrated around the point of the subject rather than the point of the state. So it'll be interesting to come back to the state and rethink this question. Now, let me first say that I'm not going to necessarily offer one posited argument in this talk. I'm going to talk about perhaps multiple strands, diverse and multiple strands within this question of the state, the neoliberal state more specifically, but also the state in general and posthumanism. And perhaps some of the reflections would be more isomorphic than, very consciously, intricately interconnected. We could come back to these things in the discussion. Now, the first and let's say the opening thought in this paper, that's where it all comes from, is this question, as I said, can the nation state as an apparatus, to use the Althusserian term, can the nation state as a dispositive, the Hegelian term, or the apparatus as an Althusserian term, can it ever be post-human? Has it always been non-human, even inhuman in certain questions? But I think the first thing we need to sort of grapple with is the very humanization of the state. If we look at the discourse of patriotism or the discourse of nationalism, hyper-nationalism globally, India is of course a case in point. What is interesting there is this idea of the state, which of course has a long and complex history. I'm not going to necessarily chart that history, but there is a certain humanization and even a gendering of the state, of the nation state, that fuels the very discourse of nationalism. The mother, the state as the mother, the nation as the mother, the Deshamatrika and all of that. That discourse itself points to the fact that there is a necessity to humanize the state. There is a necessity to anthropomorphize the state. Does that mean that the state is inherently non-human? This is perhaps the first question. And when we think of someone like Althusser, and this I think comes from the kind of Hegelianism he imbibes, because there's a very strong emphasis on the logic, the question of logic. Of course, we cannot forget Hegel's intervention into logic. He was always interested in the logic of politics, the way politics as a system functions. And, hence the structural Marxism in Althusser. What we have to first sort of begin with is this idea of the state as a machine, an old enough idea, right? The state as a machine. But the reason I'm sort of beginning with Althusser is that in Althusser we have a very clear critique, what is, of course, for want of a better expression, a post-structuralist critique of the state function. And that is combined in a way with a certain critique of humanism, a very strong critique of humanism, as we know in Althusser's framework. He's one of those famous French anti-humanists in the middle of the century. And in fact, the whole of French continental philosophy at that point was quite strongly anti-humanist, except Sartre. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. That's a tangential comment. Now, again, the next question is, when post-humanist philosophy rethinks politics, how does this new notion of politics negotiate with the very concept of the state? So, to put more specifically, the question would be, can there be a state in post-humanist politics? Isn't the very idea of state too humanistic in a certain sense? Humanized, as we have seen, because possibly it is inherently non-human. When we say that the state is a machine or the state is non-human, again, we have to think of the state as an ideology. an ideology is not exclusively human. Again, an apparatus or a dispositive as a logical structure, as a system, is not necessarily human. The human is, of course, a component of that composite structure, but it's not entirely or exclusively human. That's the sort of very simple point I want to begin. Right. So let me move on. And I'm sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint. A little weary of PowerPoints these days with all this online teaching. So you'll have to bear with some of the slightly long citations. This is a particular citation on neoliberalism from Thomas Lemke's article, Foucault, Governmentality and Critique, which appeared in Rethinking Marxism. I'll read a part of the longish quotation. One important aspect of the New World Order is the reconceptualization of external nature in terms of an ecosystem. Nature, which once meant an independent space clearly demarcated from the social, with an independent power to act and regulated by autonomous laws, is increasingly becoming the environment of the capitalist system. So we have a movement from nature to environment. And as Lemke goes on to suggest here, in this age of sustainable development, this conversion of nature into an ecosystem or nature into environment is part of the neoliberal state function. And of course, I mean, we can go back to Foucault's famous discussion of liberalism, and this very simple but very important definition in The Birth of Biopolitics. That's the text I have in mind, where Foucault talks about the effect of neoliberalism as a sort of extension of economic rationality into areas that were not previously considered economic. So it's an economization, let's say, of the non-economic, right? So if that is the starting point of liberalism, what does neoliberalism add to the plate, so to speak? So this idea of nature turned into environment and the environment of sustainable development, in a way brought within the purview of the political function of the state, is an important point to keep in mind as we go on, and eventually when we talk about Latour and others. Interestingly, the discussion, at least the official discussion, within the neoliberalist framework of polity, is about the death of the nation state. As we know from a very elementary understanding of neoliberalism as a philosophy, it is based on this idea of deregulation of the economy, transnationalization of economy. So the economy will not be determined or dictated by one particular nation state alone. I mean, it goes perfectly well, of course, with the philosophy of globalization. So there is a certain discourse of the death of the nation state or the retreat of the nation state. But of course, we cannot confuse this with the left idea of the withering away of the state or the dissolution of the state and the formation of the commune, as it were. They're two very different ideas, in fact, oppositional ideas. So what is often called the myth of the minimal state in political science, in discourses of political science, when we talk about neoliberalism, that in fact is one of the things I want to sort of focus on a little bit. Is this an actual death, or as is suggested in the expression myth itself, if it is not a mythical death, so to speak? Sorry, because I have a document open here, I'm just checking if I'm still there. Yes, I think I'm there. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so let's continue. So one of the ways in which the post-human literature addresses the question of the state, and here I begin to talk about that literature a little bit, at least in parts, is again the radical politics of the subject in relation to the state. So a book that would be recommended in this context is Hamid Dabashi, and the name of the book is Corpus Anarchicum. Dabashi locates the posthumanist notion of the human body in the political cultures of protest, radicalism, especially incarnated in the figure of the suicidal subjectivity of the bomber. And he primarily charts this movement from the Enlightenment humanist body to the post-humanist body in the era of globalized capital. And this is a fragmented and fragmentary body. The context is post 9/11 Islamophobia, America's war on Iraq, and so on and so forth. And he's also discussing subjects, militant subjects of Arab Spring, the Israel-Palestine conflicts, and so on and so forth. So Dabashi proposes an idea of the post-human body that is not indifferent to the working of religion in the political discourse. For him, the post-human body is a site of resistance to the state's attempt to take control over the human body from life to death in instances like death penalty, battles over abortion, gay and lesbian rights, and so on and so forth. So again, we see the political positioning of the subject body as opposed to the state. There is a sort of under-theorization of the state as such in literatures like this. The body that self-explodes, to continue with Dabashi, that defines the biopolitical controlling of the state. And it goes without saying, the politics of posthumanism has to resist biopolitics. It's on the other side of biopolitics. Biopolitics is where state is located, and the posthumanist subject is located on the other side of biopolitics, as it were. Just to give some context, Dabashi's one of his examples is the self-immolation in 2011, the self-immolation of Mohammad Bouazizi, who killed himself in protest against the autocratic regimes and became an important trigger subject for the Tunisian revolution of 2011. And again, it represents, as I said, the failure of the Enlightenment body of humanism in all its glory. What we have is this expendable body of radical politics, as it were. So that's just one instance I wanted to give, of many, of course, where the question of the state is only seen in this adversarial light. And it's not really a consideration whether, as I say, the state itself could be theorized as an independent entity within the literature of posthumanism. Now, the question of democracy, of course, brings in a certain kind of collective, the people, the demos. Okay? And there's a certain human centricity to some of the notions of the democratic collective, which posthumanism would like to critique. Just as it would use bodies to criticize the neoliberal policy of the state, it would also use an opportunity to critique this anthropocentric definition of democracy. I mean, that is why perhaps the state is a complex notion to tackle when we are talking about posthumanism. Nevertheless, we'll just continue a little bit. Another strand that I don't think I'll be able to go into too much, but we could come back to this in discussion, is this possibility of thinking spectrality as a non-human phenomenon. This is the famous Marx, Derrida, Zizek reading of the global capital and its circulation as a spectral phenomenon. So if the circulation of global capital across nations is a spectral phenomenon, that could possibly open up a non-human or a potentially post-human dimension of reading that loop or that network of circulation. So again, that's just a remark, as I said, I'll throw open among others. Right, I mean, I've already mentioned the neoliberalist narrative of the death of the state. Now, very briefly, I want to zoom in on a particular let's say a particular framework or a particular way of thinking the state in relation to the event. And I'm talking about a particular essay by the French philosopher Alain Badiou. It's called Highly Speculative Reasoning on the Concept of Democracy. It appears in the book Metapolitics. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on Badiou because the point is not to go into an excursus here. But the point I want to highlight, and again, Badiou is one of the students of Althusser, so we are charting a certain trajectory here, when it comes to thinking the machinery of the state, or the machine of the state, to use a term which is perhaps rife with certain post-human speculations. Now, what Badiou talks about, without getting into too many jargons, is this very complicated kind of a paradox of the state, where the political event will unmask the state. As we know, Badiou is the philosopher of the event, so to speak, and the event is always contrasted with the state. In his early sort of Maoist orientation, he would talk about politics as a destruction of the state. In later Badiou, it becomes politics as a sort of distance from the state. And this is the more left kind of a dissolution of the state we are talking about, not the neoliberal narrative of the death of the state. So what I want to do is to contrast the two and see whether there are some exchanges possible. Now, in this particular essay, when he's thinking of the political event, this is a slightly different theorization from the classic Badiouian theorization of the political event, where the event is always going to supplement the state. Here, he's talking about the state power showing itself, exhibiting itself in a certain way, so as to create a measure for itself. And this is the paradox here. On the one hand, the state power would like to believe that it has an immeasurable power. And when it wants to show its immeasurable power, it ends up creating a measure for its own power. So the paradox is between the immeasurability of the power and the measure or the calculability of the power. So the exhibition of the state of its own power itself creates this limit. So let me read a very brief passage from an otherwise complicated. It's excess of power, the repressive dimension. But it also shows a measure of this excess, which in ordinary time does not let itself be seen, because it is essential to the normal functioning of the state that its power remain without measure, errant, unassignable. The political event thus puts an end to all that by assigning a visible measure to the excessive power of the state. So this paradox of the state exhibiting its power and in the process sort of getting captured, as it were, getting incarcerated within a certain measurable excess. Let's keep this in mind, because this in a way goes to show the sort of the loop of self-deconstruction of the state, how the state deconstructs itself. And this is an event which is statist. And this is very different from the usual narrative of the event in Badiou's philosophy. But this is again another way of thinking how the power of the state can be curbed by the event. And the reason I'm mentioning all this in the discussion of posthumanism is that, again, to spell it out, this structuration of the state. And what Badiou eventually does is to mathematize the structuration, as some of you might know. This entire procedure is a certain, the more distant it becomes from a certain direction of humanism, where the state is seen as a sort of, let's say someone, a parent figure, institution of the family and the institution of the state. We'll not go into that. An important philosopher within the larger discourses of posthumanism, though he never claims himself to be a posthumanist, his notion of the and one from middle Latour, one from the late phase. So in this, this is a set of lectures, essentially, reassembling the social. He defines composition of the common world. So what is important here is that, Latour's idea of politics takes its bearings in nature. the political composition of nature, the formation of society excludes the non-human. And I quote again, nature assembles non-humans apart from the humans, society collects humans apart from the non-humans. And that's the division he wants to upturn. So, as he observes, if there is a society, I quote, then no politics is possible. It's very interesting, decoupling of the social and the political. So the very formation of the society is a breach in nature, which makes politics impossible. And this is, of course, Latour's own idea. Has to, quote, trace again and again the paradoxical shape of the body politic in a political way. So it goes beyond the human, precisely because it is not coterminous with the social, but it's a collective of nature. And this is what the actor network is. Of course, the actor need not be human. The actor could very well be non-human, goes without saying, right? The politics of nature is, again, I quote, to carry out the task of political epistemology forced upon us by the various theological crises. And here Latour is contextualizing the question of the actor network in relation to Anthropocene debate and so on. Let me just move on a little bit. What he proposes is a kind of political ecology, nature on the one hand and society on the other. In politics of nature, he proposes a single collective for political ecology of the non-human and the human. Now the question is, can this collective be coterminous with the state? Can we have a post-human state? I mean, to go back to my essential question. Now, in this ecology, of course, the distinction between the human and the subject, insofar as the non-human is an acting subject, collapses. There is no such distinction. They can exchange properties, as Latour would say. Again, for want of time, I won't go too deep into this question, but let me just proceed a little bit with this particular section where Latour talks about the state. And he is categorical on this point that this collective, the single collective, is not the state. It cannot be the state. If it were to be the state, there are some speculative questions here that let me read out from Latour as a quote. I quote, what is a state that would see itself neither as a collective, nor as the common world, nor as the end of history? Mark all these negations, right? What is a state that would no longer believe that it was endowed with the power of divine science, a state finally capable of governing, unquote. And again, to quote again, to the liberal state is opposed the liberated state, a state freed of all forms of naturalization. So this is the irony. When we get into the politics of nature, there's no requirement of naturalization anymore. And as he qualifies again, the state cannot be taken as a totalizer. It cannot be taken as what he calls a rational agent of history. So if we look at Graham Harman, another object-oriented ontologist, and his reading of Latour, there's an awful lot of literature that Harman has produced on Latour alone, apart from his many other works. He talks about this object-oriented politics, which could be one way of thinking about post-humanist politics. Again, the question that it throws open is, does it require the state? Does it require the entity of the state, right? And this has, again, I cannot go into all these details, but it has a very complex sort of political tradition, which goes back to Dewey and Lippmann, right? And especially this idea of the political public, or to use Lippmann's term, the phantom public. But this public is not a state. It's almost like a demos of radical democracy, right? So again, to go back to the point I've been trying to make, when we are talking about a community formation, that's absolutely vital to post-humanism. But a community that is not exclusively humanist, or does not believe in species humanism or hierarchical humanism, at the same time, it's not necessarily a community that has to be governed by a state. And this is a sort of a utopian political suggestion, as it were, which goes back to Lippmann and Dewey, because, especially Lippmann, because we have this idea in Lippmann, of course, that what drives politics is the issue, and the issue is the object. So it's around environmentalism that a certain group of activists come together and form a public. So a public is generated in the wake of the politics and not the other way around. This is the crucial point to me. Now, with this, of course, I mean, he develops this idea of ding politic, Latour does. Ding politic, ding in German would mean thing. So thing politics rather than real politics. Again, I don't have too much time, but if I had, I would have gone into another set of object-oriented thinking or thinkers, Levi Bryant and Tristan Garcia. So just to very briefly touch upon the point, their idea of an object democracy is non-statist. It's not a statist idea. It's an object democracy that is in fact staunchly anti-state. Very briefly, to define the point at least, and we are talking about The Democracy of Objects, of course, Levi Bryant's famous book, and Tristan Garcia's book, The Form and Object, a treatise on things. Now, in both these books, of course, differently, they talk about an idea of object democracy, which is, again, a utopian idea of objects without manipulation, without human manipulation. The original structure of objects, the original arrangement of objects without human manipulation. And that is a certain equality of things, as it were, without what Garcia would call accumulation. So the entire idea of the formation of the state would have to depend on this accumulation of objects. But what if the object remains, unaccumulated? Okay. I'm aware of time, but we perhaps, Samrat, I'm just checking with you. Can I take 10, 15 more minutes? Is that all right? We started a bit late. I'm not sure about the time.
Maybe another 5-7 minutes.
Okay, sure. No,
I think. Yeah.
At most, I'll conclude within 10 minutes, and we can come back to this in discussion. Sure. Thank you. So another question that we could address here is, what kind of subjectivity does the state create? So the capitalist state, as we know, has all these tailor-made ideas of subjectivity. Of course, it's another discussion whether we want to call them subjectivities, but it creates a certain, at least let's say, a mask or a visage of subjectivity. And again, I don't have the time simply, but I'll briefly make a nod towards the work of Lazzaruto here, Mariuso Lazzaruto, especially Signs and Machines, Capitalism and the Production of Subjectivity, a book that was written in 2014. Now, he primarily works with a Deleuze-Guattarian model of the desiring machine, the subject as a desiring machine. But the interesting point that he makes is that the philosophy of neoliberalism is built on this idea of making political economy identical with subjective economy. But as he says, this is a project that fails. In fact, neoliberalism fails to articulate the relation between these two economies. And he goes on to talk about the entrepreneurial self as the mode of self, or the norm of the self, normative subjectivity that is created by the neoliberal state. But are these human subjectivities? That's something to think about. Is the entrepreneurial self human? Of course, we understand the connection with neoliberalism, right? Because it promotes deregulation. It also normalizes self-regulation of the citizen subjects. Okay? So with these somewhat disjointed, I'm afraid, thoughts in mind, let me take the next 5-6 minutes to conclude with two literary instances that hopefully chart a certain trajectory. So the first one is the 1922 play by Rabindranath Tagore, Muktodhara, or Waterfall. I think it's a very interesting play which shows, or which asks this question. Of course, the traditional way in which this play has been read is that it's an allegory of the freedom movement, of colonialism, Dhananjay Boiragi, the famous character from the play, is a sort of analog to Gandhi. And there's a certain reading of the play that I won't go into, of course. But I think the central question of the play, which comes back to the human-machine relationship, is what I want to very briefly talk about. And again, traditionally, this play has been read as a kind of, like most of Tagore's works, as a sort of romantic, appeal to nature, as opposed to the mechanization of civilization, technological modernity, and so on. But the central question of the play is an ecological question. And it's a very interesting question. On the one hand, we have this welfare state mentality that drives the construction of this dam that is being built with the royal engineer Vibhuti, because it's supposed to solve the problem of the flood. But on the other hand, it's going to leave all the neighboring provinces without water. Okay? It's going to kill thousands of farmers. So there's this very complicated critique of welfare state in the play, which is based on a certain kind of sectarian thinking. Muktadhara is, of course, the name of the waterfall, and the dam is shown on stage as this gigantic machine. From the very beginning, this sort of ominous machine is shown there. So, of course, the question that we need to ask here is whether the state's machine building is humanist, or is there a certain, post-humanist dimension to this, right? Again, I don't have the time, otherwise I would have perhaps read out a few sections from the play. But nevertheless, this idea that Vibhuti, the engineer, christens, is the sort of religious dimension of the machine. He says it's God's throne in ours. The force of the machine. That's his machine. That's his mission. Sorry, the mission and the machine work together. So it's a very triumphalist discourse of humanism that underlines this, machine construction, as it were. And what we have is the machine as an altar, as I say, this machine as an altar. On the other hand, we have this sort of natural imagery, or nature imagery, I should say, which continuously, especially in characters like Sanjoy, we have this constant representation of the machine as it were being absorbed by nature. Like the machine has pierced the heart of this evening. I'm quoting from the text. It seems like a stricken bird falling head foremost into the valley of the night. And at the end, when we have this sort of, let's say the cost of freedom, as it were, is that sorry, I'm just looking for the detail here. Sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, Abhijit. Abhijit is ultimately swept away as he tries to combat the machine, but he's successful in getting rid of the dam, as it were, and the water flows. The waterfall comes back. But that final moment, the kind of imagery Tagore uses, there's a certain, he says there's a weakness. This is again Sanjoy describing it for us. There's a weakness in the structure of the machine, and Abhijit gives a blow to it, the monster machine. And I quote, the monster returned that blow against him. Then Muktadhara, like a mother, took up his stricken body into her arms and carried him away. So again, we come back to this discourse of the mother nature. But is this the kind of post-human politics of nature, or a sort of romantic harking back to nature? The naturalization of the nature as a mother, as it were, as a mother figure, as opposed to the monster machine. I would like to contrast this, and now I don't think I'll take more than 2 or 3 minutes, if that's all right. I will contrast this with Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and the way she continuously uses these non-human figures throughout the text. Of course, famously, the first chapter itself has that title, Where do old birds go to die? And the preface to that first chapter talks about ecological crisis, and this whole problematic of how the ecological pollution, the environmental pollution leads to the death of the old birds, and we don't notice them because there's too much going on. The last chapter of the book is titled Gui Kion, which refers to the dung beetle that remains wide awake in the middle of the night and continues with its laborious duty of giving light, as it were. And throughout the text, for example, there's a poem by Tilottama, which goes something like this, and it's a patterned poem which resembles the flight of a bird, and it goes, how to tell a shattered story by slowly becoming everybody, no, by slowly becoming everything. So this movement from everybody to everything, again, goes back to ding politic, as it were. But I want to finish with in the final chapter, the scene of the crow, what I would call the scene of the crow, and that, I think, in a way would summarize the transition we are talking about from Tagore to Roy. There's a conflict here between the performativity of the nation state and the non-human. So, and by the way, again, if I had had the time, I would have developed a bit more on the very place, Jannat guest house, as opposed to the nation state. This graveyard and these very peculiar, socially marginalized, non-humanized characters which appear in Jannat guest house and the place becomes a kind of alternative to the very operation of the state. So that's one of the larger points I had in mind while thinking about this novel. But to come to the scene of the crow, so this is the TV is showing the Independence Day celebration. So we are talking about the performativity of the nation state, the dissemination of the nation state, to speak like Baba, and we have the celebration of the nation state, as it were, being telecast on the television. Now, right at that point, and again, it's typical Roy-like satire that she brings in the Chinese brand of string with which these kites are made. So essentially, there are people flying kites. She doesn't mention it, but seemingly to celebrate the Independence Day, people are flying kites with the Chinese brand of string. And these kites, of course, are quite dangerous. As we know, the strings are quite dangerous. A string sort of half kills this crow. And the crow knows if it tries to cut through the string, it will definitely die. So we have this bizarre and a very occultist kind of a scene of a major crow collective on the sky, where there's one crow which is stuck in the thread, in the string, and there are all these other crows going around it. And we have this congregation, this non-human congregation is counterpointed with the performativity of the nation state, the celebration, which is another kind of statist congregation. And she refers to crucifixion, occultism, apocalypse, and so on. Eventually, the crow is saved through a miracle, as it were. I wouldn't go into that, but let me finish with this counterpointing that I think suggests that the state is perhaps insufficient as a structure to think of post-human politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Arka. It was really an enlightening lecture. We got to know a lot of things, but I'll just try to quickly summarize some of the points and maybe ask a couple of questions, taking the privilege of being the chair. The thing is, Arka, while asking whether the state can be post-human and has in the end summarized the state to be inadequate as post-human, he moves through a trajectory of critical theory, philosophy, which deals with the complex relationship of state on one hand being humanist, traditionally following the Enlightenment trajectory of a kind of singular entity, a sacrosanct singular entity that the state is, towards the neoliberal understanding of state as disseminating the goods, services, and other benefits to the citizens, kind of collaboration, a collaborative entity. And there are also the anxieties of the state being transhuman, going beyond human and becoming a larger category. And I think that is also present in the religious discourse of humanism. In the very discourse of humanism itself, there are the possibilities of the human becoming the transhuman, because the transhuman is even always better than the human, because it is the overhuman. And by becoming the transhuman, there is always the danger of alienating the human subject. And he also deals with the complex relationship between the social and the political, and whether we can think in terms of binaries, like the state being posthuman and the political being the posthuman, and the social being complex, because they are, and I think what is very pertinent in this discussion is the danger of appropriation. There is always the humanist danger, the danger of universalization, which can not only affect the human, but also can affect the post-human. So we should not think of post-human always as emancipatory, but it also has the possibility of just like the neoliberal state functions. On the one hand, it claims, particularly in the context of India, where it thinks of the state as a singular monolithic entity having a mind and a body of its own, but at the same time it also maintains several fragmentations, just like the biopolitical apparatus, which it needs to manage and address every time in order to legitimize itself. That is what we see in today's political world. Different caste and class and gender and ethnic identities are constantly being addressed, but also on the other hand, the state is constantly producing its own non-human. So the post-human of the state, as you very aptly pointed out, that the state cannot be enough post-human, because the post-human of the state also creates its own non-human other. So the collaborative utopia, which you have dribbled through the thoughts of Badiou, Harman, and other philosophers, that utopia doesn't arrive. Rather, the utopia has a tendency of moving towards the dystopia, where the state is creating its own non-human other. So, and my precise question is the question of the religious discourse, that how the religious discourse in the Enlightenment and the period just after the Enlightenment is very different from today's neoliberal use of the religious thinking, where it always needs to, it is on the one hand, it has a humanist claim, as I already said, and you have also narrated, but also there are post-human potentials. So how these two apparently opposite ends are managed? This question, I will open the floor, and you can address this, and then we can open the floor for other questions.
Thank you so much, Amrita, for that very cogent summary and a very difficult question, I must say. And I'm not really a religious studies person, so I'm not 100% sure how deeply I can answer or even respond to this question. But of course, you're very right in pointing out that there's a difference in terms of the way religion plays out in relation to humanism from the Renaissance discourse of Renaissance humanism or Enlightenment humanism and the contemporary discourse of the religious. So I suppose one question that, one way in which I can respond to this might be a very naive response, is that there's a certain, let's say, resuturing of the religious and the political in a way that was perhaps undone by modernity to a certain extent. At least in a certain discussion point, we could say the modernization of politics meant a certain secularization, where the religious authority and the political authority were severed from one another. But there's a kind of de-severing that has happened now. And especially, and not really right now, as it were, because of course, we have had these arguments of the theological understructure of democracy, even in late Derrida, for example, right? That famous essay on truth and belief and knowledge, I think. So there's that.
Knowledge and faith. Yeah.
Yes. And this particular question of course becomes much more important, much more relevant in India, where perhaps it's very difficult to think of a political collective which is a-religious, which is completely non-religious or a-religious. So one has to negotiate with that. But I think what becomes quite interesting if we think of that entire politics of religion, especially in the Hindutva brand, is the manipulation of the animal and the classic anthropomorphization of the animal, the Gomata, right? The Gomata is a classic anthropomorphization of the animal. So it goes to show what you were talking about. I'm just using it to illustrate the point that humanism and a certain kind of anthropocentrism or anthropomorphism is the very technique of this religious process and the way it is politicized. So I would say anthropomorphism is a tool to politicize the religious discourse. And there are various complications attached to this. This is not just a question of deifying the Gomata. It's also, for example, if we think of instances like the Una case and multiple instances across the country where Dalits have been beaten up for even coming close to the cattle, as it were. I mean, on the one hand, there would be an expectation of scavenging, to use that word, which is otherwise not perhaps the right word to use, but nevertheless, to put it under quotes, let's say, on the one hand, there's an expectation that they would remove the dead cattle. On the other hand, their manipulation of the dead cattle or any kind of, handling of the dead cattle would create all kinds of ruckus to the point of beating them up, killing them, and so on. So this has its own political network. And I know this may not be absolutely relevant, but to come back to the point, I should have mentioned this in the talk. The reason I chose Muktadhara is that there's a very interesting, almost an uncanny similarity between the dam development project there and the entire project of the Sardar Sarovar Dam in Gujarat and the construction of the famous Statue of Unity, right? So again, I mean, what is interesting there is that the very structure of an anthropomorphic counterpart of Vallabhbhai Patel is at the very core of that entire state discourse. So again, we clearly see the collusion of state and anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism as a statist tool. Maybe this is something I should have sort of clarified. But I think that's possibly the very limited answer that I can, or limited response I can give to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Arko. I think there are some questions in the chat box. Let me see. I think Shubham has a question and Ashijit also has a question. I think first Shubham and then Ashijit. You can just switch on your mic and you can ask the questions. And then I will take maybe one question from YouTube.
I can actually see Shubham's question, so I can respond to that. Maybe.
Please read the question. That would be.
Should I can read it out?
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So good morning and thank you for your fascinating presentation. Just I wanted to know, is there any scope of sorry. Can the increasing thrust on the technological surveillance, like the launch of different contract tracing apps or apps that regulate the effective boundaries, be seen as a movement towards the post-humanization of the state? So can you see it that way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. I think that kind of goes back to Samrat's point. I would say yes to that, of course. I mean, predominantly, that it is a certain strategy of post-humanization possibly, or at least a kind of transhumanization. I'm not 100% sure if I would use the word post-human there, because again, within the philosophies of post-humanism, there is a very strong thrust on the politics of emancipation, or philosophical post-humanism, as Ferrando or Braidotti would call it. But nevertheless, you're right in saying that there is clearly a manipulation of the human to, in a sense, get us back into that progressivist narrative of technological revolution. I mean, a classic example is voice recognition. there are many countries, I don't think India does it as yet, but they might do it in future. There are many countries that use voice recognition to get into many of these, IT accounts and things like that. So the voice recognition is a classic example of humanizing the state apparatus at one level, but that humanization is also, again, deeply problematic, because in a way we are, using the human vector of the voice to precisely transhumanize it, to create it as a certain technology of security. I mean, there's a lot more we could say about that, but for sure, I mean, the apps, especially the app boom that has happened, the tracking apps are a literal example of what you're talking about. Yeah, so let me stop there.
I think there is always the tension between the transhuman and the posthuman, because one can always become the other. It's deeply anxiety ridden. So, Ashijit, can you ask your question?
Yeah. So, Arka, thank you for your paper. It was amazing, as usual. So, I have a two-part question. In fact, the first part, I don't know how much sense it would make. So, just broadening the scope of how you're reading state in general as, let's say, ideology, or later on as an act network theory, or however you put it. But I'm just trying to, reimagine, is it possible to, let's say, a community which is governed by nature, to call it a state I mean, does it really have to be, I mean, what is politics then? It becomes a real question then. Can something which is completely surrounded by nature but is inhabited by people be called a state? That's my first question. And the second question is, especially in the current political scenario of our country, when we see that there is a tendency of defining the human by the non-human, or let's say by the natural. Let's say there is a claim that Ayurveda can cure the decaying or the aging body, or the non-human cow can, is let's say your parent, your primal parent. So how to negotiate between that kind of human which is defined by the non-human, which is also a kind of claim by posthumanism, which talks about a kind of interspecies relationality. So when it is really happening in our country, we see the kind of alienating effect it is happening on human beings in general. So how to negotiate these problems also, so if you can answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashiji. Those are excellent questions. I'm not sure if I'll be able to. Let me give a fairly straightforward answer, which is sort of in a way the extension of what I was trying to say there. That you're right. I mean, no, it cannot be possibly called a state. And that's why I think that's exactly what thinkers like Latour and others are trying to say, essentially, that that single collective, which is a slightly utopian idea. Of course, if we go back into the other aspects of Latour's text, he also talks about a certain formation of politics before the distribution of speech across the species. Again, it's a very complicated idea, and which is quite utopian in nature or speculative in nature. So it's very difficult to say how practicable that could be. But in a way, there's a whole tradition of political utopianism we're talking about. He's clearly not alone. But I would basically say to the first question that no, it's not a state and it cannot be a state. And that's why at the end I kind of pointed to this insufficiency of the state as a structure to hold what we are talking about here, this single collective. The second question is much more complicated, and let me again, this is my opinion, of course. I'm sure you or anyone else could have another opinion on this. So this is the point. I actually don't think what the Indian political ideology of Hindutva is doing now as a governmentalist ideology is posthumanist. I don't think it is posthumanist because it is so strongly centered on the idea of anthropocentrism. Right? I mean, be it the cow or the other non-human aspects that you were alluding to in a way, Ayurveda and so on. Ayurveda is a more complex question again. I don't know to what extent I can talk about it. I know very little about it, to be honest. But I think if we think of the question, this entire sort of nativist discourse of for example, the archaeological project, the Hindutva model of the archaeological project. It is again centered on a certain kind of, not just a discourse of pride, but also this very strong humanism, a glorious, triumphalist humanism. Everything was there in India first, all the technologies and so on. You're, of course, right in saying that the human is being defined from the position of the non-human, but I don't think this particularly, this particular strategy is enough to call it post-humanist. Yes, definitely it could be called transhumanist, and that has been the tradition within post-humanist discourses to oppose a certain kind of state-backed capitalist transhumanization. So that is definitely happening here, no doubt about that. But I think it cannot be called post-humanism if we agree on the fact that post-humanism is anti-anthropocentrism. Because what we have in this discourse is a very strong anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism at work, both in fact. Right. So that's how I would perhaps respond to your question. But thank you. I'll have to think a little bit more about it. That's a good question. Thank you.
There is also a romanticization of nature, because romanticization also involves a certain kind of singularity. There are some. I will read one question, at least from the YouTube stream, because otherwise it would be an injustice. Can the geopolitical, it is asked by Shayan Poriyal, can the geopolitical cleaving of India during partition be seen from a post-human perspective?
Can the geopolitical cleaving
of India?
This is talking about the partition. Right. That's a very enigmatic question, I must say. I'm not sure how to respond to that, because maybe I understand it's a YouTube question, so there are word limits there to ask the question. But I'm not sure how partition and posthumanism can be brought together. Maybe we could think of the question of violence and how certain, of course, just again, let me give a very simple example here, which I was working through in the book that I'm currently writing. There's a famous story by Manto called Titwal Ka Kutta, the dog of Titwal. And it's about this dog which is fed by both sides, both the Indian soldiers and the Pakistani soldiers. Now, the dog ultimately dies. It's killed. It's brutally killed eventually. But the basic point is the dog is claimed by both and also named by both. And it's this human naming of the animal that eventually causes the death of the animal. That's one of the ways of thinking about the narrative there and the plot points. I won't go further into it. But I think we could possibly think of the animal trope in partition literature, in partition writers, especially the writers like Manto, to be a certain, again, it's reductive to say that they're all post-human in a certain way, but at least we could go back to the collusion between the nation state and, humanism in that context. Let me limit myself to that. It's a big question, and it's a question that I perhaps don't understand.
There are some other questions, but I think we can not take more than one question, because we have to close the session and continue with the next. I am Devashish has a question. So Devashish, can you ask? Just switch on your mic and ask, maybe.
Okay, Samrat. Arka, that was a really fascinating talk, and you brought in so much from so many different directions. Really, I think the time was really short for exploring these directions. But I'd say that it's a fascinating talk on the state and its post-humanist, what one might call non-implications. But even this suturing that you talked about between the transhuman or the religious and the humanistic state, it's really what's happening right now. That's almost like a putting on top of the humanist of this superstructure of religion. But I'd say it would seem from your talk that posthumanism reactivates the discourse of a politics of friendship, looking at it from the other side, or of a politics of philosophical anarchism. This is contradictory to humanism because such a politics is non-monadic. You cannot isolate it on individual human subjects. But can we think of a collective that operates in this manner as a sort of politics of the future, a kind of post-humanist quasi-state, if you might call it that?
Right, right. Thank you, Professor Banerjee. That was, again, a difficult question. Let me try and be brief. I know we are almost out of time. So I think, let me put it like this, that a lot of posthumanist theorization is strategically futuristic sometimes. I'm not saying every posthumanist articulation is futurist, but there is a very strong speculative dimension within posthumanist philosophy, at least, and the different strands of posthumanist philosophy. I definitely agree with you on that point about anarchism and this idea of the speculative future. The point about, I'm also reading your question as I speak, the point about this non-monadic and the nomadic, and I like that wonderful wordplay there. That's very interesting because, I mean, that's the Bridottian approach to posthumanism. She would basically build upon the nomadic philosophy coming from Deleuze primarily, and continue with that idea of a process ontology, but of course complicated, and she's also critical of that term itself, as we know. But nevertheless, I mean, she does continue to talk about these nomadic assemblages within posthumanism in a certain way, assemblages that are not just human, non-human interspecies assemblage, but these are also assemblages that work across disciplines. So certain fields emerge, as Braidotti has more recently argued in that book on posthuman knowledge, posthuman, I think it's, I'm not sure about the title, but it's on posthuman knowledge, where she talks about the sort of, you know, decentering of disciplines, which is absolutely central to this. But I agree with you on that idea of a politics of friendship, or to use a more sort of Ambedkarite term, Maity, as it were. You know, again, I mean, there are ways in which we could possibly go back, and I think we should, when we talk about the Indian discourses of posthumanism, we have to go back to Ambedkar as well, and the whole field of caste studies, or perhaps Dalit studies more specifically, and Ambedkar's own sort of manipulation of, let's say, the motif of the animal, which is quite strongly present in Ambedkar. Again, one of the chapters of this forthcoming book, I'm trying to engage a little bit with that, especially his texts on slavery, and also the very detailed research that he did on the Indian, let's say, shastras, for want of a better word. Again, they are replete with all these fascinating anthropological details about cultural practices with the animal. And he was very interested in that, because that, in a way, defined the social position of the Dalit in many ways. So I think there's a lot to be done with that, which I know I'm wavering a little bit, so let me stop there, and we're also out of time. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arka. Thank you, Debashishda, for this interesting question. I think we will end this session, in this like particular session here, and wait for the next panel. As we decided, we will give some time for people, maybe 3-4 minutes. Arka?
I'll just get a coffee.
Yeah, just after 3-4 minutes, just come back and, you know.
And I'm just checking one quick thing with the participants. Is everyone here? All the 3 speakers, I think?
I think so. For maybe Amit is there, I think. Deborshi is there, and Shubhadeep is there, and Sukanya is also there. Okay.
So we'll come back in 3-4 minutes then. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm back, and just give me one more minute to.
Sure.
Just to get the details of the participants. And the time is 12 to 14 minutes, right?
Time is around 12 minutes, 12 to 14 minutes. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Just give me a minute. I'll be ready in a minute. Okay, so I think we can get started. So shall I just take over from Redda and get the session started?
Yeah, please start.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to this session. This is the first session of the day, and we are going to continue to talk about the nation state and neoliberalism. That's the larger theme for this panel. So let me, without further ado, start with the first speaker, Sukanya Maity. Sukanya Maity's paper is titled Posthumanist Interpretations of Surveillance through the Introduction of Multiple Choice Questions and the Need to Fit In. So Sukanya, if you could briefly introduce yourself before you start, that will be wonderful. And we are going to have a time limit of around 12 minutes. So if you could please keep to that, that would be great. So we can start whenever you're ready. Thank you.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
So good morning, everyone. I hope it's still morning. Yeah. I'm Sukanya. Firstly, I'm grateful to the Indian Posthumanism Network for providing me with this opportunity to, as young as I am, and I feel privileged to share a room with the scholars who have utmost knowledge in this field. I'm an undergraduate student of sociology from Jadavpur University, and well, this is the first time I'm dealing with posthumanism as a field of methodological inquiry, and I hope whatever mistake I make will be forgiven. So I have titled my paper Posthumanist Interpretations of Surveillance through Multiple Choice Questionnaires and the Need to Fit In. As Chattopadhyay, you spoke about entrepreneurial subjectivities and thereby the advent of entrepreneurial identity and rationality, and also spoke about Muktodhara and all I could gain. Of course, I did gain a lot of things and I have been enlightened, but I think that there was a point, a very emphasized point of empathy and memorialization throughout your entire talk. And also how neoliberalism has kind of overshadowed this empathy and memorialization. And as Sir Sengupta said, that transhumanism and posthumanism often seems to overlap, so it's better I start with neoliberalism with a brief introduction of neoliberalism and how it triggered the capitalist advancement as well as the monopolization of education through the introduction of multiple choice questionnaires. Neoliberalism brought to the forefront the concept of transhumanism to manufacture its ideal citizens through technological aids. The economically rational actor of post-enlightenment was to be moved away from the emotional beings to more technical, disciplined citizens. Michel Foucault refers to this ideal subject as Homo economicus. The transhumanists who view technology as the most or the foremost solution to underdevelopment reduce individual bodies to storehouses of information that can be controlled and manipulated. Posthumanist interpretation or posthumanist scholars like Chattopadhyay and my mother was a computer argues against such technophilic transhumanism through her theory of how information lost its body. Biotechnological enhancement underpins the objective of transforming the imperfect human into a perfect one that would be economically beneficial, a methodological injunction whereby transhumanism and neoliberalism intersect with each other and become one. The mind occupies the rank of being more human against the body. Consequently, the transhumanist breakthroughs, which had initially claimed to benefit all, remained restricted to the wealthiest sections of American society. Many posthumanist scholars like Weber and Speckman emphasize the merging of humans and nations to enhance human capabilities. In the face of rising right-wing extremism in India, accompanied by a wave of corporatization and capitalist consumerism, state-sponsored surveillance to achieve homogeneous rationality and efficacy has grown too. Education institutions are the most susceptible to a transhumanist and technophilic posthumanist transition to manufacture desired citizens as being fed by the state. Absolute knowledge codified into facts serves as the only basis for evaluation. As her rector says, the posthumanist school and university, in a reductive economic sense, and I quote him, together with the accelerating and intensifying reliance on new media technologies, therefore already presupposes the reality of an ongoing process that might be called posthumanization. The question, however, is that if we proceed to do away with the traditional and lofty concepts and discourses for their rigidity and unidimensionality, why and how are we aware of what is absolute or what is perfect? So I almost hold neoliberalism, communalization of education that led to the manufacturing of ideal citizens under for the lack of a better term, I refer to this process as installation. Multiple choice question format by focusing on mathematical precision renders critical articulation.
I'm really sorry to interrupt. Could you speak a little bit louder? It's a comment from Rosalanji, and I kind of agree. I mean, because I'm using earphones, I can hear you. But for those who may not be using earphones, it might be difficult to hear you.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Am I audible now?
Yeah, it's better for me, but I think someone hearing this without earphones, I think they would be in a better position to clarify.
Yes, you're better. Can you come closer to the mic a little bit?
Sure, sir.
Thank you.
As Professor Abhijit Pathak defines this process of standardization as the poverty of pedagogic imagination due to their attempt at viewing knowledge as the acquisition of mere facts, especially in the field of social sciences and liberal arts, the teachers are deprived of the agency to think and merely act as agents in formulating objective questions and generating MCQ question banks. More recently, teachers are even barred from participating in the question framing process in general, with the National Testing Agency or the NTA, an Indian government agency set up in 2017, taking the mantle of doing so. While both transhumanism and posthumanism aim to replace our knowledge, has been constructed for eons, that is privileging a small group of people over the majority of others with a newer version of it, the latter might need to undo rather than replace knowledge with a conceptual creativity that potentializes a new vocabulary that invites complexity and the chance for change. It is through interaction with each other and the world that knowledge is produced. However, this process is disrupted by growing importance allotted to the acquisition and storage of information in the form of facts that are not to be disagreed with and must not be placed under contestation. According to Howlett, I quote him, "The times we live in seem to necessitate a reassertion of the human precisely because it is part of What is threatened by neoliberalism's adjudication, making the profitable or productive life indispensable, exemplified by the turn in teacher education to conflict good teaching with good data collection. Taking a glance at the recent political unfoldings leading to an intensification of youth movements and protests against the decisions of the state, which has resulted in an attack on democratic and premier educational institutions in the country, whereby scholars and activists have been unjustly imprisoned, beaten up, and humiliated to suppress their voice and crush uh, dissent. Profitable would I, I, I almost can say that profitable would exclusively denote the ones who accept the authoritarian regime and its words as the ultimate truth and act as loyal subjects. Moreover, scholars and historians like Mirula Mukherjee, Aditya Mukherjee, and Nandini Sundar have researched on and expressed their disdain for the way education has been communalized by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, a right-wing Hindu paramilitary organization working under the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. A network of private schools like Vidya Bharati are run across various states in India, following a similar pattern of civilizing nation based on humanism that was earlier followed by the Christian missionaries. With the exception that now a Hindu man enlightened with knowledge gained from Vedas, Upanishads, and other Hindu texts is recognized as an ideal human being. As Sundar states, for the Hindu nationalists, social sciences, especially history, is intimately connected with inculcating national identity and patriotism. The nation is identified with dominant groups in society, and only narratives that value the role of these groups positively are seen as patriotic. And hence, it is time we delve deeper into the more pathological effects of fact construction. The new national curriculum framework, which was introduced in 2000 to serve the new communal agenda, where chapters written by secular historians in NCERT textbooks were removed. Whilst opposing it were labeled as anti-national assassination was removed from the textbooks. Gujarat State Social Studies textbook that had categorized minorities as foreigners, anti-Muslim rhetoric was propagated as it came to be considered barbaric and uncivilized. Misrepresentation and misinformation accompanied by a state monologue are constructed as facts which need to be memorized without questioning. Students are barred from finding out the reasons behind what led to the formation of these facts or how history has shaped them. Post 2014, under the Prime Ministership of Narendra Modi, the most charismatic leader of the BJP bandwagon, the politicization of and monopolization of education has intensified and worsened. A similar pattern of MCQ is now considered as the most correct form of evaluation, where one has to choose the right objective of a policy introduced by the government, whether or not the policy has been implemented at all. Whether it distorts and disrupts democratic structure of the country, and whether or not it promotes discrimination and violence. So I think it is very necessary to emphasize and memorialize. I think the post-humanist pedagogy should take this into consideration. As in Catherine Hales, in her book How We Became Posthuman, explained the intensifying desire among the neoliberal states to erase the boundaries and burdens of a human body and transform it into non-matter, into more information. The civilizing mission of framing and silencing that has remained abated from the medieval to post-enlightenment to neoliberal era has made us go from what Donna Haraway says, the comfortable old hierarchical denominations, to the scary new networks called the informatics of domination. When posthumanism seeks to decry the Western tradition of humanism, it must not entirely focus on object-oriented ontology like cybernetics, computerized communications, biotechnology, and so on. Posthumanism in a globalized age, must first realize that the limits and the democratic possibilities of humanism in relation to interactions between a colonizer and a colonized, uh, the majority and the minority, or say the head of a multinational corporation and their workers, as Isabella Stengers opined that instead of a closed one whose research finding would either be a disconfirmation or confirmation, we need open science. A science that is not afraid of remembering the cultural, political, historical construction of science within humanist networks. Hence, the students must have the agency to empathize, to memorialize instead of just memorizing, to lean on minute complexities of everyday life while engaging in a discussion in the face of a communalist and corporatized threat where human bodies are reduced to mere statistics into bare lives. It is important for both the teacher and the student to engage in discussions where empathy, solidarity, and grievances play an important role in pedagogical performativity. For what good does education serve if it accepts genocide, war, and exploitation as mere facts? There is also no absolute truth. I mean, is it even possible to describe exploitation in a word or two? And how do you know what is rightly known as exploitation and what isn't? Hence, there is no absolute knowledge, no single truth. Thereby, I conclude by saying that there is a pressing need to redefine humanity before moving into posthumanism. And perhaps that should be the ideal goal of posthumanist pedagogy, if I am not very wrong. According to Barbara Grant, and I quote her, we don't necessarily need new methods in academia. Rather, we need to imbue our procedures with new forms of alertness and new forms of representation. Zakia Iman Jackson presents the question of whose conception of humanity we are trying to move beyond to explain that instead of reframing the problem, posthumanism kind of erases it. Scholars of posthumanism, I feel, need to engage themselves in academic underpinnings, and a prime way of doing so is to place a system of encyclicalization under scrutiny, as it does exactly what posthumanism seeks to challenge, that is, reducing human to the ability to perform rational judgments that maintains the hierarchy of life ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukanya, for taking the time. And that was a very interesting paper, of course, talking about how the pedagogic system has practically reduced the teachers to fact-finding agents, or facts for that matter. Great. Okay, so we will move on. Our second speaker is, it's a joint paper, Deborshi Aradhar and Amit Mondol, and the paper is titled Tracing the Ontic Singularity from Brahman to Big Brother. I would request the two speakers to start the paper and perhaps introduce themselves before they start, and we can let's try and have it in 12 minutes or so. Thank you so much.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Amit Mandal. I'm a professor at Arka. We are both pursuing a PhD from University of Delhi. Well, the title of our paper is Tracing the Ontic of Singularity from Brahma to Big Brother. Well, without much ado, I'll proceed. Well, singularity represents that moment in space, time, and history wherein human knowledge systems fail to capture and comprehend a part of whole of reality. Our paper selects the idea of singularity as represented in the transhumanistic discourses, alongside tracing similar pastures in the classical Vedantic concept of Brahma, especially as addressed in the Advaita Vedanta tradition. Well, the reason for such a trans-epistemic study is simply to trace the analogical similarities and ontological differences of technological singularity and the concept of Brahma that are both produced within human context and yet somehow transcend them. Technological singularity in its essence imbibes two famous hypothetical scenarios. One, in which it gives a transhumanist utopia for whole civilization, bringing forth possibilities like radical life extension, cognitive enhancement, or even immortality through human-machine mergers, like mind uploading in computers. And in another scenario, it posits that it can be humanity's last invention, as many futurists think, which poses an array of existential questions for humankind. Well, it holds within itself both the possibilities of a beginning and an end, starting from a point when artificial intelligences will supersede human intelligence by exponential rates, bringing forth human-level AI or artificial general intelligence or AGI and artificial super intelligence or ASI. Well, if we talk about human intelligence is an evolutionary extension of animal intelligence, but technological singularity might symbolize both extension and transcendence of human intelligence, or all intelligence in general, a million times or so. Well, it might symbolize the next step from that of Turing's thinking machines to AGI or ASI. It might also represent the shift to machine as a god, or god as a machine. But what concerns futurists, technophiles, Luddites, or average humans like us is the nature of the super intelligence. Will it be a benevolent god or a malevolent dictator? Well, questions arise. Does it have any practical validity other than being the stuff of speculative or imaginative fiction? Well, the primary argument has been given by Ray Kurzweil in what he calls the law of accelerating returns. It simply means the better the technology becomes, the faster it improves itself, thereby generating exponential growth in a quick span of time. And in the long run, it will suddenly wake up and become self-aware. He also predicts, based on his assumption, that technological singularity might come around the year 2045. Well, now the question comes that why do you need to build an AI that will not be able to control? The primary reason would be massive economic growth, which can be achieved through automation, thereby getting rid of many biological constraints. Human-level AI can open up portals to an alternate dimension-like possibilities of redefined lifestyles for humanity. Autonomous machines will reduce human errors, plus mass casualties in a war-like scenario. Besides, in near futures, humanity might face many existential threats or challenges that can wipe out humanity, like to include some climate change, more potential pandemics, asteroid impacts, energy crises, etc. In such scenarios, our last chance might be building an AGI and uploading, so to speak, all our epistemological frameworks on the same. Anthropomorphizing the AI for better reasons, however, carries its own potential risks. For example, famous futurist Nick Bostrom believes that AI might pose an existential threat to humanity itself. Well, privacy and ethics advocates for benevolent AI systems argue against a Big Brother stance in a similar manner, as they don't want an Orwellian surveillance state, and that even if they did, there's a risk of it turning into a totalitarian dictatorship of epic proportions. The idea of Brahma, as presented in the classical Indian philosophy and the Advaita Vedantic school, shows a resemblance akin to the nature of singularity, especially in the breakdown of our ability to predict beyond that point, as noted by Stuart Armstrong. Brahma as commonly referred to in the Rig Veda, alludes to the divine, the holy utterance that is sought to hold within itself, the key to an enlightened realization and understanding of the universe, the self and the universe both with and without the self. Well, the singularity we seek in Brahma then refers to being in this tripartite state of Satya, truth, Chitya, psyche, and Ananda, bliss, that somehow goes beyond the proper capturing of human cognitive and cognitive frameworks, while employing them at the same time. As Harvey Dewey Griswold notes, Brahma is often meant to stand for the whole, the heal, the charm, force, inspiration, devotion, prayer, spiritual power, and absolute reality. Brahma, as espoused in various other schools of Indian philosophy, is always performative in nature, and thus attached to a purity of cognition, especially on the embodied and embedded levels. That is in being manifested here ritualistic practices. It is astonishing to note, however, that such a spiritual and holistic concept such as Brahma can give grounds for the rise of such social stratification when misappropriated within specific context that began as early as the Vedic period. Like the ruling priestly class, that is Brahmins or Brahmins, with their direct access to scriptures, procured therefore the terms and conditions of the information, and in turn, as it followed, the manipulation of its contents as well to suit the well-being of a certain section of the mass. The latter interpretations of Purusha Sukta, as noted by D.R. Ambedkar and Arvind Sharma, are often quite undeniably cited as such acts of vandalization that brought about the malediction of the Varna of our system. Startled. The following instance is a key insight into the gatekeeper problem, whereby a certain class that has access to the valuable information automatically rises up the hierarchical line or next one there. Well, it is interesting to note the following development in direct allusion to social singularity or technological singularity, or its precursory places. Well, in a society that still reads heavily of the anthropocentric biases, it is worth pondering upon the question that individuals or organizations in charge of creating and maintaining such AGIs or ASIs exercise a right that somehow benefits a certain class than others. Even if the technological singularity boom happens in near future scenarios, wherein AGIs or ASIs become overtly independent, the data sets upon which they shall be trained, as in according to the current machine learning techniques, are already biased and manipulated in nature, can be subject to the same for a select course by select class. Well, then perhaps a tangible way out might be present on the hermeneutical grounds of philosophical posthumanism that advocates for a post-dualistic and post-anthropocentric treatment, as noted by Francisco Ferrando and Rosetta and others particularly. Well, it might even be so that Brahma Vidya itself is an attempt to dissolve the anthropocentric principle in locating its presence beyond that of human embodiment alone on a larger cosmological scale. Well, by setting aside anthropocentric politics and biases of humanizing the other, the tenets of philosophical posthumanism can offer us a much benign and holistic perspective on the transhumanistic problems of social singularity and the parts to say.
Thank you, Amit, for taking the time. In fact, I think you're okay, perfect. So we'll move on to the next speaker then, Shubhadeep Paul. And the title of his paper is Biodenials and the Billboard Religious Imaginary, Posthuman Defeatism in Present-Day India. So if I could request Shubhadeep to start.
We're listening.
Shubhadip, are you here?
Yeah, Arko, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think it's okay now.
Yeah. And
thank you so much.
If you could please introduce yourself. I mean, since I'm asking everyone to do that, thank you.
Good noon, everyone. I am Dr. Shubhadip Paul. I'm Assistant Professor, Department of English, School of Literature, Language and Cultural Studies, Bankura University. I wish to thank Professor Banerjee for inviting me over for this particular talk and giving me this opportunity to speak a few words on the topic on which I'm going to speak. Samrat and Arka, we go back a long way, so not going into any specifics regarding that. At the very beginning, let me just say that I've been ailing for a long time, repeated viral attacks. So it's literally the ailing subject body pitted against an unfeeling state machine, constantly denying vaccines and creating a very unhealthy atmosphere to survive at this particular moment. Having said that, before I proceed to the fundamentals of my paper, the bare skeletal outlines, I would like to mention this, since the broader rubric of discussion is the interfaces between neoliberalism and the nation state, or the neoliberal nation state, or going a little further, possibility of a post-liberal nation state. We must keep in mind one thing, and which is this, that when in 1938, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek first coined the term in Paris, they did it under a certain, socio-political experience, the experience of collectivism at failure, the experience of social democracy as having some pitfalls, and of course the specters or the unfeeling spectrum of Nazism and communism at work. So there was a overarching atmosphere where the state was increasingly being seen as suspect, to the personal development of the subject. And from there on, when neoliberalism started appearing more and more theoretically and politically correct, I think that is where the root of all problems also started to come up, because neoliberalism, promulgated itself as a sort of wolf in sheep's clothing, proverbially speaking, because if you look at it very carefully, we understand that when we talk about the collapse of ecosystems, we can actually link that to a host of other post-millennial maladies, if I might put it that way, such as the financial meltdown or the recession of 2007-8, and the offshoring of wealth and power, as we have seen with the Panama crisis. And of course, the almost universal slow collapse of public health and education, and also, the growth of the epidemic of loneliness, and as far as my paper concerns, the rise of right-wing extremism, which has played a major part in what Debashish also talks about, the idea of the corporate psychopower. But it has become understood gradually that neoliberalism is not really a very sacrosanct and neutral force, and the seemingly utopian millenarian faith that it seems to kind of uphold might actually be at the cost of the privatization of public services and the vilification of trade unions and their ideas, and the inevitable creation of a natural hierarchy of winners and losers. So to say, once again, where the idea of the welfare state model itself becomes one of a futile exercise, because it is quite evident that the very creation of an equal and equitable society is seen as sort of counterproductive in this kind of a state apparatus. And not only that, it's even at times perceived as morally corrosive. So monopoly power, even, which is something which would be treated with a high degree of suspicion in the case of most, business ethics parlance that we talk about. Even that would be sanitized. Else, how do we explain the ruthless sale of airports and other national assets, and that to going to single players in the market? Now, having said that, I feel that once we understand these interconnections and we no longer speak about the ecology or the environment in isolation, but we see it as part of a larger network, a part of an interconnected web of ideas and lives. That is where I think a post-humanist understanding of the state of things becomes more and more evident. And that is also the praxis that leads us to kind of investigate upon the concerns of neoliberal environmentalism. Of course, I'll be talking about third world environmentalism in this context, and talking about Ramachandra first world environmental policies and politics. But when we speak about neoliberal environmentalism, we realize that that too standardizes a very rigid state control over environmental territories. And all sorts of resources are seen as necessarily objective, agencies to be experimented with in as many different permutations and combinations possible. And when we are doing that, we are, opening up the controls to regulation, and we are cutting down public expenditure. We are opening up the markets to investments regarding exploitation of natural resources. And what happens, that's precisely what my paper focuses on. What happens when all this takes a catastrophic predicament, as we have seen in some of the very recent events in the recent present and recent past, where such kinds of catastrophes have been faced in contemporary India. And this has been, as I posit, because of a sort of a non-relational praxis between technology, religion, and the environment. We have seen a very notable paradigm shift, and this paradigm shift can be explained in terms of a technology-backed theophany. But development chronicles that are chained to anthropocentric monopoly, they are being sanitized as petty casualties for profitable utilitarianism. Now, because of this, a possible and a potential Indian post-human future, very broadly speaking, has been shunned for the moment. And I think that once this process becomes trend set, it's very difficult to reverse it back, take it back to the position from where it started. It's not really a very reversible phenomenon. And these development policies are not founded on species welfare. They are not really attentive to the subtleties of cosmopolitan democratization. And the natural equilibrium has been avariciously exploited. And what we find in this case is a plutocratic privileging of investment capital over the very idea of natural sustainability. And this is what I would also kind of, like to describe as the billboard religious imaginary, because there is a lot of, advertised, upholding of this promotional idea of what is going to be good for the nation in the coming years. And much as it is wanted, much as it is showcased as the next India shining thing, maybe, I find this in due course to be a very baneful pantheon promotional. And this is what leads to post-human defeatism for the subcontinent at large. Because all kinds of, psycho-spiritual technologies are sort of rendered farcical in this context, where a jingoistic anti-heterodox is kind of, leading things to an almost post-disciplinary dead end. And this inevitably leads us to question also the very sense of the planning ethic in India today, which seems to be very atrophied and mercenary, and definitely fatalistic in the light of post-human continuities and contiguities. So to cut the long story short, if I might focus basically on the highlights, we realize that much of the post-anthropocentric social work that has taken place in this country which context of the natural environment had tended to be kind of ignored and trampled over. Why was this so? And I'm picking up India as a basket case, India as an example. I'm sure that this would echo very largely with other countries also, countries where there would be, I think similar kinds of working governments at the very present, whether we are talking about Mexico's AMLO or we are talking about Brazil's, right-wing government, which of course very recently has called for the impeachment of the president. There's a mass outcry for that. I'm not going into political details. That's not the objective of my paper, to just simply account for a sort of a political camp outrage. But the basic, trajectory, the basic, very linear trajectory, in fact, that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that India has been the base for several ground level environmental movements, because when we are talking about the failure or the unfeelingness of the state as a body, as an organism, basically if we go back to all the all the theoretical paraphernalia associated with the nation state, theories associated with the nation state, if we assume that the nation state does have a life its own or has a dynamism of its own, it is also because there is a reciprocity with the citizens. It's a body politic that gives the state this life, and the state gives it back. So there is a sense of reciprocity involved. And when the state becomes objective, an unfeeling state machine, as I pointed out right at the very beginning, then what is the resultant consequence, what are the ramifications of this kind of activity that basically is very diabolical, both the short term and the long term, or if not in the short term, definitely in the longer short term, and if I might say, because when we speak about climate catastrophes, we are no longer speaking in the long term, as we already know about this by now. So India has been the the base of the Chipko movement of 1973, and we have seen several parallels of events like localized events that sort of sought to pit itself against a larger unfeeling governmental work, something that very presumably happened in the case of the American context of ecotage, ecological sabotage, as you all know, is evident in the work of Edward Abbey's The Monkey Wrench Gang, 1975. So the 70s and the 80s had been a period where these things were very evident, these things were very rife, and we have seen in the case of the earlier half of the Congress government, especially after Nehru, we have seen it largely in the case of Indira Gandhi's regime, because Indira Gandhi, according to me, was one of those rare prime ministers who had a certain environmental makeup about her decisions and thinking out of schemes, maybe because of her, as I pointed out in my paper, her close relationship with environmentalists like Salim Ali and ornithologists and many other kinds of people working on allied areas. But then, of course, we see a downswing from the 90s onwards, and because of that, I definitely see that once Manmohan Singh came to power, much as that would lead to some kind of economical revivalism, the environmental ministry actually became a sort of a showpiece in the dressing room kind of syndrome. So what happened from there on, and what happened after we entered the new millennium, what happened in the first 2-3 decades, is what I'm going to just very briefly touch upon. So my point is this: that ground level.
I'm really sorry to do this, but if you could conclude in the next 5 minutes, that
definitely
would be great.
do that. I know time is short.
Thank
you. So I was just like coming to the tail end of my paper, basically. So having said all this, the basic idea that I would like to just point out, something which would maybe strike the tenor of the paper, is this: that this has led to a sort of a severe bio-denial, if I might put it, right? And eco-precarity has been rendered most callous in this point of time. And earlier, what was kind of denigrated as sort of a Western conspiracy or conspiracy of the agents of Western imperialism. And these environmentalists were, the ones that we kind of know, who have been there in the limelight for a very long time. They were kind of denigrated as socialist stooges and old-fashioned leftists and all that. And of course, much of the development work that we see has been to do away with the license permit quota raj of the Congress government. So that has been to welcome more foreign investment and of late private investment in India. But at the same time, I think the Union Environment Ministry in the last 3 decades, I'd like all of you to have a look at that, 1990 to 2020, if at least it's a very long time scan. You would see that environmental stress in India, if I might use that term, has literally kind of gone up several levels. I don't know how much, but definitely several levels. But what needs to be stopped are the gynocidal or geocidal, suicidal project ventures that have taken place one after the other. Chamoli very recently. Anything, I think, after the Kedarnath tragedy 2013, nothing has stopped. And so heinous acts of ecocide continue to be inflicted one after the other. A muscular right-wing nationalism is playing a total blind eye this downswing, and the fate of the topographical minorities hangs on the balance. So having said that, I would want everyone, at every level, wherever we are, at the bourgeois level, at the subaltern level, at the grassroots level, to understand and find ways out to counter this ambivalent, schizophrenic, and lukewarm response of the state towards the existing ecology, and counter this seemingly monomaniac and meaningless billboard religious imaginary that is plaguing our country today. I think if we can do that, maybe we can change what the Journal of Democracy describes India as. We can change the idea of an illiberal India, because you cannot check this idea unless you control the idea of the reckless Anthropocene. So sheer ground level vigilance.
And Anna Chattopadhyay is an assistant professor at Kolkata College in the English department. Our paper is titled Cyber Community Formation through Pokemon Go and the question of post-human private spaces in India. So I'll just share the feed here. I hope that option is available, right?
Yeah, it should be
to the informative machines displaying emergent behaviors, especially from an Indian perspective. The resultant central conflict, as occurring in the game as well, is between the humanist idea of freedom and private agency versus a post-human notion of freedom, commensurable with the post-anthropocentric scenario. This slide gained some prominence, the post in this slide gained some prominence back in 2016. It exemplifies the utopian prophecy of virtual augmentation eliminating all social conflicts of serious nature, which is enabled by the game's universalization of private space. The irony that the reactionary, traditionalist, humanist and capitalist ideals underlying this promise become evident by the consequent degeneration of this paradigm of this game into a paradigm reflection of the social distancing we are experiencing right now. The open world nature of Pokemon Go takes positive individualism, which I've defined here, to transhuman level by taking the ergodic nature of the game into an extreme, it eliminates an impression of, it creates an impression of unbound freedom. It establishes a space at once private and unique. Pokemon Go provides this transhuman illusion of agency and in exchange assures conformity. So the player is free to move in any direction on this map, geographically possible, but he or she is not the actual master of this private space. Anthropocentrism is presented in the game visuals, which can be literally moved to made to revolve around the player's avatar present here. But the number of actions that this avatar can take is limited by the basic orientation of the game. By basically substituting mobility for spatial autonomy, it obtains the player's agreement to the terms and conditions of the game. As visible here, an exclusivist autonomy is earned at the cost of the effacement of all local particulars. Any resistance that the subject might face in the form of distractions from external entities disappear, to the point where the gamer is almost solitary in an open world. The game indeed does provide in-game friendship opportunities with real players, and also make bonding with other players necessary on multiple occasions, such as gym raids. Nevertheless, the exploratory part of the game remains the more fundamental feature of Pokemon Go. The game does not offer the freedom of expression of culture diversity, but instead neutralizes all forms of diversity to make the gamer comfortable. Dependence on human intentionality, whether that of the programmers or of the gamers, to the point where it now displays an emergent behavior. In Pokemon Go, we see the inevitable transfer of agency to cybernetic automation rather than any human homo economicus. This meme is an apt representation of the superhuman effort that the gamer have applied not to master, but simply to cope up with the workings of the artificial life of the game. This desperation takes the individual participants closer to the posthuman paradigm as they appropriate, keep faith in, and predict as far as possible the actions of this invisible hand for greater success in the game. As Sukanya Physics notes, you see here, owing to the prevalence of the non-intelligent or non-human form in the game, in games, I quote, the post-human player may be thus described as a decentralized assemblage actor, sitting at the crossover of human and machine, with its circuit boards, cables, buttons, and triggers of the game engines running in the background. The most well-known manifestation of this behavior in case of Pokemon Go is the use of third-party softwares or apps by players who intend to cheat the GPS tracking function within the game to earn extra experience points. Once the artificial life attains autonomy in a cybertext, the individual player takes a backseat while automated bots play against each other. Not surprisingly, this practice is regularly condemned and punished as unethical by the developers, as harmful to, they say, the integrity of the community, even though the existence of spoofers in Pokemon Go community is well known. Now, especially to an Indian gamer, the hypocrisy in this notion of integrity would be evident, since rather than leveling the playing field, it serves to preserve the advantage that a Western or urban player would have over a post-colonial player. The humanist conservatism implicit in this idea of ethicality is apparent, since beneath this establishment of the free market functions a techno-feudalistic and Eurocentric bias whose interests the developers would like to preserve. The concentration of gyms and Pokestops is notably higher in urban areas and especially in the Western countries, thus causing inconvenience to the players from more rural areas of India, especially in the time of the pandemic, since they cannot travel to an area with abundance of resources. So the integration of the post-human agency in the game proves to be an effective mode of writing back for the Indian gamer. The replication of emergent behaviors is necessarily done in groups through cyber community. The gamers are compulsively partaking in cyber communities to improve their chances, mirroring the advent of occult economy in the new millennium. Jean and John Komarov describe occult economy as founded on, I quote, the effort to conjure wealth by appeals to techniques that defy explanation in the conventional terms of practical reason, quoted. The microtransactions, Pokemon trade, and in-game currency in Pokemon Go replicate the spectral enchantments mobilizing such occult economies and normalize the practice of faith-based speculative action. As with any faith-based organization, the possibility of radical mobilization of opinions lurk in this community. And the game developers have capitalized upon this tendency by making the gamers choose between three teams: valor, instinct, and mystery. The occasional toxicity of this quasi-sectarian organization is easily visible on online social media platforms, but the gamers continue the in-game conflict. Yet, the automated structure of the game also keeps it from becoming entirely dogmatic, since there are no certain principles around which these cyber communities are securely organized or stratified from within, thus leaving enough scope for non-serious interactions and critical distance. The critical perspective in this meme.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you should conclude in the next couple of minutes, right? You're running out of time.
2 more minutes.
Sure. Thank you.
The critical perspective in this meme is enabled by the fact that the very notion of fidelity that dogmatism requires is rendered spectral by the constant semi-automatic alterations of the principles of the game. We may see this in terms of the elements of PD and looters, which we have explained here. Since much of the content of the game centers around Pokemon battles and the leveling of the players, it is bound to create competitive hierarchical cyber communities. However, simultaneously exists there an open world gaming experience in which apparently insignificant and eccentric behaviors might be indulged in, even at times rewarding them through future updates of the game. The emergent behavior of the game encourages the battalion laughter that may dwarf the master-slave dialectics implicit in Latour. It establishes a heterogeneous core in the community which recognizes that there is no finality to the laws, they being always subject to the emergent behaviors. This inadequacy of the gurus signifies the general inadequacy of the rational choice theory, which was supposed to define the human according to positive individualism. Therefore, I conclude, besides the false imperialistic form of freedom that Pokemon Go projects, thanks to its artificial life, the game also offers a post-human freedom that can be exercised in a non-serious domain both within the game's open world and in the cyber community. This content that could emerge now, this content taken from one of the Facebook communities of the Bengali players exemplifies the format.
I can't hear you, Nisarga. Yeah, okay.
Sorry. Am I audible now?
Yes. And I think, at least for me, I just saw the comments that you're posting there. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay. I'll conclude shortly. While humanism defines the subject as a rational being, the primacy of PTF proves Adorno Horkheimer's contention that the key motivator for the Enlightenment subject is not reason, but pleasure. The pleasure of mastery over the unreasonable other. But now we have entered the point where this pleasure is finding the mold of rationality inadequate, and hence occurs the rupture of the human. This rupture of rationality corresponds with the overpowering humanist intentionality by the game's artificial life. Hence, the transgressive outbreak of battalion laughter at Moloch's consumption of the totality and consequent regurgitation of this global simulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishargo. If you could stop sharing the screen, that will be excellent.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, to just kind of thread together the papers we heard is quite an exciting kind of diversity we saw in this panel, starting from MCQ questions and the whole pedagogical field to, Vedic philosophy, to environmentalism and the state apparatus and the history of the Indian sort of negotiation there, and finally to gaming. So I'm pretty sure there'll be lots of interesting questions here. Again, I would request Nishargo to perhaps stop sharing, and so that we can come back to a gallery view, I guess. Yeah, but nevertheless, I mean, so I think we have around 15-20 minutes for questions. So we could start with the questions from the chat box, or you could let me know. I know there's a question already from Samrat. So let me begin with that question. Samrat has a question for Sukanya. So Sukanya, if you could please address this. Do you think that the multiple choice questions transforms the human into non-human, a machine meant for carrying out orders? It is also a process of enslavement. Sukanya, do you want to respond to this maybe?
Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
So I think any structured curricula does that, which is why philosopher Ivan spoke about deschooling of society. But since we are at a stage where it's practically not possible, I think we need to mend our ways, and I think post-humanist interventions and interpretations could help in doing so, as I already said. And when such enslavement or such structured curricula is also coupled with neoliberalism and as well as extreme right-wing capitalism, I think it's dangerous. So of course it leads to enslavement. It's weak also. And if I'm allowed to share a screen, I would like to share with you all a set of questions, like those simple MCQ type of questions that are from a Gujarat State Board competitive exam, if I'm not very wrong. So if I may share my screen.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sure that will give us some time to formulate the questions. There might be other questions in the chat box. So as Sukanya is sharing her screen, let me reiterate, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, or you could just, there's a raise hand function, you could do that, or you could unmute yourself and ask your question, whichever you prefer.
So here is an, may I speak?
Yes, Sukanya, but I can't see your screen so far. I don't know if others can.
Well,
You'll have
I'll have to check once more.
Yeah, I think there's some problem it seems. Yeah, now I think it's coming. Just give it a moment. Yes.
Is it visible?
Yes, I think it is.
Okay, so here's an instruction.
A little bit further. Yeah.
Here's an extract, somewhat, as I said, a similar question and answer pattern from a publication of Vidya Bharati, taken from RSS school texts and the mother of Mahatma Gandhi, by Mridula Mukherjee, Aditya Mukherjee, and Sucharita Mahajan. And I will just maybe read out the questions and as well as the short answers. So here are a set of objective answers without the questions, of course, like the facts. Um, uh, some of them, so I'll just read some of them. The credit for lighting the lamp of culture in China goes to the ancient Indians. India is the mother country of ancient China. Their ancestors were Indian Kshatriyas. The first people who began to inhabit China were Indians. The first people to settle in Iran were Indians, specifically the Aryans. The popularity of the great work of the Aryans, Valmiki Ramayana, influenced Yunnan, that is Greece, and there are present-day Greece, and there was also the poet Homer composed a version of the Ramayana. The languages of the indigenous people, or the whom they refer to as the Red Indians, of the northern part of America were derived from ancient Indian languages. So now I come to the question-answer format. Which Muslim plunderer invaded the temples in Ayodhya in AD 1033? Muhammad Ghaznavi's nephew, Salar Masood. Which Mughal invader destroyed Rama temple in AD 1528? Babur. Why is Babri Masjid not a mosque? Because Muslims have never till today offered namaz there. Which day was decided by Shri...
Sukanya, if I may stop you there, I think we all get the drift of what you're talking about. Rather than reading the rest of the questions, if you could, if you want to comment on this, please go ahead with that. I'm also aware of time and we should have questions for all the papers.
Okay, so shall I stop sharing the screen?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Please stop sharing. And if you want to make a further comment, of course, on the material that you just read out, please go ahead.
So as I have already stated earlier, I think neoliberalism coupled with capitalism as well as extreme right-wing Hindutva, I think in a very structured curricular format, I think they lead to enslavement. And also, since we have reached a stage whereby it is not possible to de-school the society, I think we need to mend ways instead of just kind of letting it happen. And it is more dangerous because not just the school kids, but also we see such exams appearing in competitive exams. So such questions appearing in competitive exam question papers. So that's I think really dangerous.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I think what's interesting to just go back to Samrat's question is this. I mean, the objective dimension of the MCQ question and to what extent it makes this sort of machinic assumption. In fact, it's interesting that we tend to use those terms, right? We call them subjective questions and objective questions. So MCQ, in a way, is an erasure of subjectivity, perhaps, at some level. And that's a very interesting point. So I'm just looking at the chat box. I don't see any more questions, but please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions. And then perhaps we can also go to YouTube and take some questions from there, if any. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Questions for the other papers, especially, I mean, Sukanya has already had a question. Questions for Deboshi, Amit, Shubhavidhan, Shargo, Anunna.
Yeah, I can have a short question on Deborshi and Amit. Like related to what I asked you, that the question of the singularity which he is talking about, the singularity, how the singularity of, he has drawn parallels between the singularity of the religious discourse of the nation state and also the neoliberal discourse of the nation state. But how these two can be, like the question of AI and all that, how they can be, how they are different. That is my question. How these two kinds of singularities are different, because there is a kind of universalization and celebration, celebratory tone in religious discourse, which is not there in the post-human kind of singularity. That is my
Amit,
question.
if I may request you to respond to that, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
So the thing is that when we speak of singularity in terms of religious discourse, of course, it's something that is very simple. It's like it's a good kind of infinitude that is always dynamic in a sense, that is dynamically affecting specific context. But when I speak of singularity on conceptual socio-technical levels, it's more like a singularity that constrains rather than the compensatory territories. It's a singularity that is infinite, but it is bounded in a narrow sense of complexity. It's not like an infinite humanity which is from a separate point. It's more like a narrow restricted kind of thing. If we can imagine. I mentioned it in the paper. I say there's an analogical similarity.
I can't hear you very well, Amit. Your voice is kind of falling a little bit. So could you please say that last couple of sentences at least, the last couple of sentences once again?
Yeah. I was saying that when I speak of singularity on the socio-technical basis, it's more of a singularity that is limiting in nature, that is always constraining, that always overpowers you rather than overwhelms you. In a sense, it overwhelms, of course, by overpowering and not by force. I mentioned it in the paper also that one has a synthetical closure in its infinity when I speak of Brahma as harboring elements of singularity, while the other, like Nietzschean, that is, it constantly haunts. That is the metaphor for technological or social singularity.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that response. I think I'm looking at the YouTube feed as well, and I think there's one question for Nisargo and Ananya there. So I'll just quickly shift to that, and maybe we can come back to the Zoom session and have questions from other participants. So let me read out this question for Nisargo, who's here. Minecraft teaches kids to breed animals. Isn't that non-human has been reduced to nothingness by the gamers? And there's a second part to that question which says, even in Pokemon, ultimately humans are manipulating the powers of non-humans by keeping them captive in balls. So could you please respond to that, Nisargo?
Yeah. So first of all, this is something happening right now. The dematerialization of capital as such, by which capital ceases to be something concrete. We have the rise of Bitcoin, for example. So everything is translated into capital at this moment. Even animals, for that matter, get translated into capital. That's what happened with Minecraft. But now we can also say that this is something as old as civilization itself, Eurocentric civilization at least, because even in the Bible you have man being pronounced the master of all other animals. So it goes as back as that. And I think Pokemon, indeed, there have been arguments against Pokemon that it encourages this slave culture whereby the animals slaved and used. So yeah, I totally agree with this sort of translation of the animal into nothingness. Like there is no otherness of the other in the animal left. At the same time, what I want to emphasize here is what in terms of Wallace Stevens I might call the pressure of reality functioning against the pressure of imagination. So there is the pressure of reality which occurs through the abstraction of capital, but at the same time there is a imaginative pressure occurring in the original Pokemon or in the Pokemon game that always creates an alternate value formative system, an automated system that gives an alternate viewpoint, an alternate constructive viewpoint. So I don't think this is a very valid sort of alternate, but nonetheless there are two forces working. That's what I think.
Thank you, Nisargo. So do we have questions from the audience here? in Zoom. I don't think I can see another question on YouTube at this point. So if there are questions from the floor, please go ahead. Especially questions for Shubhadipta. I mean, I might have...
If there are no one else to ask questions, then I can ask one.
Sure, Samrat, go ahead, and maybe I'll have one quick follow-up question for Shubhadipta, but after you, go ahead.
I was just thinking about, again, it is something similar which we discussed before. The religious discourse, particularly the government which is in power right now in India, they fetishize the environment. They talk about the Hindutva discourse, not Hindutva discourse, but in the Hindu, quote-unquote Hindu discourse. They have a certain tendency to, like celebrate nature. Nature has been divinated in certain ways. So how does that contradict with the way nature is dealt with? In recent times, we have seen that dead bodies are actually floating in the Ganges. So the Ganges is getting polluted, but the Ganges is also celebrated. So how would you address this kind of contradiction and essential biodenial? That is my question.
Yes, Samrat, thank you for that question. You see, like when I was speaking about this almost fetishization of a religious imaginary, we must understand that that is primarily in cosmetic terms that's being done. When I speak about, the posthuman from the posthuman eco-critical perspective, we must realize that that is being done at a material cost which is far exceeding any kind of religious sanctification. To give you a very short example, is the same Supremo who in 2011 had written an e-book called Convenient Action, and who had spoken on the lines of the environmentalist Al Gore in America. I, in my paper, have pointed out that a lot of change has taken place in the last 10 years or so in his political ideology, and of course in the broader political ideology of the party. And what has led to post Kedarnath a lot of ecocidal problems, like the Chamoli disaster that I talked about, the Tapovan Dam disaster, glacial bursts that have taken place. But and of course the Char Dham highway that's being constructed, that's on the agenda, which is leading to a lot of deforestation and pumping of the slush pile on the highly precarious Himalayan rivers. So the idea is this, that if this would smoothen out the whole process of development in these very eco-fragile zones, is something, it's a sort of political rhetoric and ideology that cannot be purchased in the long run. What's even going to happen to Lakshadweep, and I can give you many, many such examples down the line, which is ultimately going to be very spectral in nature, and it's going to be very proto-death, the way you pointed out, that ultimately it's going to be very symbolic, the way the dead bodies are putting on the Ganges. So that can be used as an extended metaphor for the several ecocidal ventures that are taking place one after the other. So yes, that is something that needs to be taken into account very carefully.
Thank you, Shubhadipta. So I think we have more or less run out of time, and since I don't see other questions, and the question I wanted to ask was partially covered by what Samrat just said, so I may not belabor the point. Thank you very much to all the participants. It was a wonderful panel, and it had a lot of diversity, and it continued the dialogues that are necessary, I suppose, on neoliberalism and the state. So I'll just hand it over briefly to Samrat, if I may, if he has any announcements to make for the evening. Thank you very much. Thank
you. Thank you, Arka, for being with us and also chairing this session after your wonderful talk. I just mention a few things. In the evening, we have a session from 7:30. I think we will share the YouTube link for those who are our audience, the registered participants and others, whoever can watch, and in the groups and also in our respective social media. And what is important is that, we are not sure if Google problem has been solved. So maybe we will, if that is not solved, we will again send another Zoom link to all the paper presenters, keynotes and chairperson. Please bear up with us and check your mails, whoever is present till now. And I think that is what I want to say. And Devashishda, are you there? Devashishda? I just wanted to ask you.
I'm here, Samrat. Yes, I'm here.
Will this same Zoom link work, or you have to create another link?
No, the same link will work. I'll just change the timing on it so we can use the same link.
Okay, great. Then I will just inform the participants just if the Google problem is not solved. Okay.
Yes. And maybe sorry, I'm just butting in, but maybe it's also important to say that the YouTube link will remain the same, just in case people get confused.
No. I don't think the YouTube link will be the same.
It is going to be the same, right?
No. The YouTube link will change. Auditro, are you there?
Yes, there will be a new YouTube link for the session that will starting from the evening 7:30. It will be given by 5:30. It will be circulated via emails, and it will be posted in the WhatsApp groups also.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you.
So we end the session. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day. We see you all in the evening, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah, see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.